thanks to you all for tuning in. Thanks to Drew and Kevin for agreeing to be involved in this conversation. I don't think we've really done an event that's been touching on these kinds of themes, certainly not for a long time. So I'm very excited. The themes, as Mariam said in the title, is illness, aging, death, but also perhaps some words with slightly more positive valences, such as healing and things like that. I suppose I associate healing with Drew's book. With Kevin's book, I suppose it would be authenticity, perhaps, would be the positive thing to emerge from, the existential quandaries of illness, aging, and death. So I think I'll just start with a couple of brief questions to you both, just to introduce you both to the audience and in the context of the books themselves. A little bit earlier in 2002, and Drew, I think your book came out last year. So Drew, I'll just start with you. Could you just say a little bit about the trajectory in your trilogy between The Absent Body, which came out in 1990, The Distressed Body, and your new book, The Healing Body? Maybe just a few words about the kind of goals of the series and the ways in which they dovetail with each other, or kind of the progress perhaps over the last however many years, 34 years.
Sure.
So
it's easy to summarize 30 years in a few lines. I'll see if I can do it. But obviously the theme that I've been exploring is embodiment, the phenomenology of embodiment, the experience of embodiment. Also, as it intersects with kind of the medical notion of the body, the biomedical, mechanical vision of the body, which often is very different than our own internal experience of it. And in the last two books, one of them is called The Distressed Body. The new one is called The Healing Body. I myself have been through different kinds of bodily impairments and chronic pains and injuries. And I've also done a lot of work with prisoners who have their own modes of impaired embodiment simply by virtue of their incarcerated position. However, I wanted to move both personally and also philosophically in a more positive direction to this new focus on healing and how it is that people kind of regain existential wholeness, even in the face of these kinds of injuries and impairments and aging. I'm very impressed by how people accomplish that, often independent of the medical system. So I'm trying to do more a typology of healing and not just a phenomenology of illness.
brilliant, thank you. So I guess as a quick follow-up question on phenomenology before we move to Kevin, what are the basic structures of lived embodiment as identified by the phenomenologists? Just a few kind of key motifs that you would have worked with in your research.
Yeah, I mean, the people we're talking about include Edmund Husserl, sort of the father of phenomenology, most famously Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the great 20th century French phenomenologist. And just to keep it simple, I would call it the I am, the I have, and the I can. The sense that in some ways I am my body, its powers, modes of perception, motility, etc., really belong to me. We would say that I am speaking to you, not that my mouth is speaking to your ears. But in other ways, we have this sense of a disjunction between self and one's body, especially at times when it's problematic, illness, etc., or under examination by others, whether medical examination or we're being physically evaluated for, beauty or whatever. And in those cases, we might say, I have a body. It's almost like a possession I'm connected to, but it's not identical to the self. And then the last one I mentioned is the I can. a notion used by both Husserl and Merleau-Ponty to say that the body has within it these habitual abilities, so that all the things I can do, whether it's speaking or eating or driving or whatever, these are abilities that inhabit my body. I'm using that term carefully to say we often have been taught these and build these up through habitual modes of learning and repetition until they've become kind of second nature. While driving the car, I can drive the car and listen to the radio and talk to a passenger and watch the scenery because it's sunk so deep into the powers of my lived body.
Super, thanks, Drew. So, Kevin, I've been reading your work for probably about as long as I've been reading Drew's work. And so when I read your book, I was interested that many of the themes that you were writing about back when I was more engaged in academic philosophy were kind of cropping up in your recent book, One Beat More, but obviously with a completely different valence. So things like time pathologies and restlessness were things you'd written about in the late 2000s, but in your new book they've been given a whole different meaning for you because of the massive heart attack that you suffered a few years ago. So I was wondering if you could put the book in context and kind of like set the scene.
Well, it's a timely topic for me personally, because one of the things that Drew is talking about with the I can versus the I have is something that I'm struggling with right now, as I've been recently diagnosed with a functional neurological disorder, which disrupts the seamless ability to talk and communicate in a way that's effortless. And so that sense of I can, that structure of meaning has been disrupted. And I'm having to now adjust my body and my identity to these new difficulties. But the book itself is a phenomenological pathography of my own experience with a life-altering event, a massive heart attack, followed by a number of complications. And I was always a student of existential philosophy. It moved me, it resonated with me emotionally, but I only understood the ideas primarily theoretically. But the heart attack made me viscerally aware of the profundity of existentialism and the way that it shakes us out of our everyday complacency and reminds us in a powerful way that life is not a dress rehearsal, that this is the only dance we get. And when the body is working well and things are going smoothly in times of youth and health, we forget our own fragility. We forget the fact that we are temporal beings and that our life is always penetrated by the possibility of death. And that maybe more importantly for the audience, we're always already moving towards illness and disability, and ultimately death. So one of the aims of my book was to talk about or explore the ways in which we can be flexible with our identities and move and flex with the upheavals of life as they invariably overwhelm us. And the message of the book is, I think you'll find, and I hope you found, is optimistic, that there is real wisdom and personal growth and transformation that can come from illness, disability, and of course, aging.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Obviously, the kind of maybe the commonsensical idea of existentialism is that it is a philosophy for the youth, and perhaps even a philosophy that people should eventually grow out of.
Yeah.
But you kind of rebranded almost as a philosophy which is perhaps best suited for people experiencing aging, especially, or illness. What do you see as some of the kind of core principles of existentialism that you think resonate so well with your own experience and the experience of the people you write about who are experiencing aging, illness, the fear of death, things like that?
Some of the things we know for sure is that wisdom is often wasted on the youth. And I was initially attracted to existentialism, as many young people are, when they're going through a period of profound life transition. So college students love existentialism because they're forced to confront for the first time, what's the meaning of my life? Why am I here? What career should I pursue? And what's the point of it all to begin with? The problem is that once you initially confront those questions, it's very easy to get sucked back into the flow of everyday life and forget how important those questions actually are. And I feel that, again, chronic illness, growing old, facing an untimely disability shakes us into an awareness, again, of these existential insights. And the core insight of existentialism is framed in a kind of pithy one-liner that's often attributed to Jean-Paul Sartre, which is existence precedes essence, which means human beings have no pre-given essence or nature. We are self-conscious beings, and insofar as we are self-conscious, we create ourselves. We make ourselves through our own meaning-giving choices and decisions. And we are making ourselves right up until we die. We are self-making projects. The other thing that the existentialists remind us of is that we don't gain insight into the human condition by means of theoretical detachment or philosophical reflection in the way that we traditionally think of philosophy. The wisdom about the human condition comes to us through powerful and penetrating emotional experiences or moods. For Kierkegaard and Heidegger, for instance, it's the mood of anxiety. For Jean-Paul Sartre, it's the mood of nausea. For Albert Camus, it's the mood of absurdity. So moods are powerfully disclosive of who we are. And that sense of who we are can't be accessed from a perspective of detachment and objectivity. And then finally, existentialists are primarily concerned not with being a good person necessarily, not with happiness or pleasure or material success, although they're not opposed to any of that necessarily. Their primary concern is for the individual to be true to themselves, to be authentic. So the controversial question emerges for existentialism. It's more important to be authentic than to be moral, because morality is a social convention. There's no moral absolutes floating around up in the sky that we can turn to. So it's more important to be true to ourselves, even though that may compel us to transgress or suspend our obligations to generally accepted social norms. And this is why themes of rebellion and revolt are so common in the existentialist canon.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah, I remember some documentary where I think after Sartre had tapped into Marxism, a lot of his existentialist friends were sort of criticizing him for having become so moral. And in our sort of world, that seems like a strange thing. But obviously in the world you're talking about, it was not necessarily seen as the highest goal. But
well, for Sartre, it's a tricky case, because for Sartre, authenticity and freedom work hand in hand. But in Sartre's philosophy, as well as the philosophy of his partner, Simone de Beauvoir, we can only truly be free when others are free. So part of our obligation as authentic agents is to critically address conditions of socioeconomic, racial, sexist oppression, to create an opening for authenticity and freedom for those that generally don't have that privilege.
thanks. Drew, was there anything in Kevin's overview of his project that you wanted to pick up on? Any resonances with your own? I guess like if Heidegger and Sartre, they're both kind of ambiguously positioned as both phenomenologists and existentialists. I know that Merleau-Ponty, who's kind of your go-to guy, doesn't feature in Kevin's book and is not generally regarded as an existentialist per se. But I was just wondering if there were any elements in what Kevin was saying that you wanted to pick up on.
Yeah, I liked, tying back to the theme of the evening on illness, aging, death, and all that, which, by the way, was meant to have a little bit of a Monty Python humorous ring to it. I'm not sure if that comes across, but I really like the way Kevin put it, that these existentialist questions that sometimes plague us when we're teenagers and we're trying to figure out the direction and meaning of our life before we've settled into a more adult identity, arise anew and in a different form when we deal with aging, especially within an ageist culture, tends to view older people as, past their prime, on a downward slide, a bit marginalized in terms of social utility, physical attractiveness, cognitive quickness, and being conversant with the latest technology. And of course, in more traditional cultures, there's an association between age and wisdom, a certain kind of farsightedness, maybe a certain kind of spiritual energy, even related to the proximity to death. And so these individuals are discovering for themselves and for the tribe at large, which goes back to what Kevin was saying about Sartre, some kind of vision of meaning that challenges and transcends our conventional focus on monetary success and prestige and those kinds of material values. I remember, I think it was Theodore Roszak, I'm not sure if I'm correct on that, who wrote a book called The Making of the Counterculture, the kids back in the 60s and the 70s who were rebelling against, the establishment. And then he wrote another book about when this generation aged, now that the baby boomers are hitting 60, 70, and beyond, and said this is actually in many ways a more interesting and powerful counterculture because people have more wisdom under their belt. They also potentially have more money, more power, more social influence in their later years than they did when they were younger. I don't know if we're seeing that in the US. In our politics. We have a kind of gerontocracy with, two 80 or nearly 80-year-old men battling against one another, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and people are eager for the next generation to take over and isn't associating either of those figures, particularly with kind of elder wisdom. One of those two people, I think, epitomizes the opposite of elder wisdom. So I won't say who. I'll leave it to the imagination of your viewers. So I guess the last thing I would say, and I think Kevin would probably agree with that, is this challenge toward existential authenticity and creating our own meaning and contributing it in a political or artistic way to the larger culture doesn't necessarily happen just because you've gotten older any more than it necessarily happens when you're young. The individual does have to make that somewhat risky choice toward authenticity, like even Kevin, talking about the neurological speech deficit he's dealing with. It's obviously not stopping him from speaking and speaking very well and very wisely. He's making an authentic choice not to let illness inhibit him, but even to let illness in a certain way open himself up in his vulnerability to others. And I won't say more on behalf of Kevin, but I admire that.
Thanks, Drew. If I could add something to what Drew was saying regarding ageism and authenticity. Ageism and ableism as well are both really weird phenomena, because unlike other isms like racism or sexism, the hatred isn't directed at some amorphous other. The hatred is directed at our own future selves. So it involves a weird kind of disappointment, or hatred might be too strong a word, despair and dissatisfaction with who we are going to become. And it certainly is a manifestation of inauthenticity. If we're truly going to own up to and accept who we are as temporal beings, we have to own up to the fact that if we're lucky, we get to grow old. And if we're lucky, we can continue to live with a chronic illness and somehow find meaning in the face of it. But to turn that distrust or suspicion of older people towards ourselves is deeply inauthentic and tremendously toxic in a youth-obsessed culture like the cultures of Euro-America.
Thanks, Kevin. Obviously, we talked a bit about authenticity, which I suppose, as I suggested earlier, is like the positive word amidst illness, aging, and death, if they tend to have negative valences. Drew, your book's about healing. Like, do you have a particular, like, neat philosophical definition of healing? And I suppose as a kind of related question, because you're both a philosopher and a medical doctor, how do you see the interactions people have with the medical system either hindering or facilitating this process of healing that interests you?
Yeah, well, I like the term healing for its etymological resonances with wholeness and holy. These come from the same roots. And, you know, we talked a little bit earlier about how when you fall ill or when you have a serious injury, disability, I just saw today that King Charles has been diagnosed with cancer, probably prostate cancer. There tends to be kind of this series of disruptions, this disruption between yourself and this body, which suddenly is threatening you, the body you have, but also disruption between yourself and others, because you may feel isolated, grappling with this illness, which sometimes is difficult to even communicate to others, and others may shy away from this sign of vulnerability or not know what to say, not know how to fix it. And then you're also in some ways cut off from your past life because now you're entering into a new identity. Your future has been called into question, especially if it's a serious illness. Often your relationship with space has become constricted. You're not able to move as freely. You might be confined to a bed or a hospital room. And so there's all these kinds of disruptions that have taken place. And by healing, I mean the recovery of a sense of existential wholeness, even if it looks different than what came before, whereby you feel that sense of connectivity to a meaningful life narrative, to others around you, to your body, which now you may need to listen to and care for even more assiduously. It's going to look differently for different individuals, just as Kevin was saying, in existentialism, we make our own meaning. In this new book, The Healing Body, I actually talk about 20 different kinds of healing that people use, different kinds of healing strategies, with the notion that what works for one person may not work for another, or worked with one illness may not work with another, or even what was functional at one, in the morning may not be the strategy you go to in the evening. And, turning to your second question, what does contact with the biomedical establishment have to do with this project of existential healing? I think sometimes it assists it and sometimes it impedes it. I'll start with the obstructions, which probably many people have experienced. You already may be feeling kind of alienated by the experience of illness, as if your body is a kind of object, and you feel a sense of loneliness, as I mentioned. And then you can walk into a hospital or a medical office and feel even more objectified, even more dehumanized. even lonelier as people are not attending to your suffering. They're just taking down your information. They're giving you a diagnostic code. They're processing you through a technological system and explaining everything to you in a kind of medicalese that doesn't really address what you're really struggling with on a human level. But on the other hand, of course, it's tremendously helpful to get symptomatic relief from medications or surgery. And I think often we do encounter healthcare professionals who are kind and who are empathetic and who are good communicators. And there's such a sigh of relief when you have a doctor or a nurse who you can trust, or you feel a little bit comforted and embraced by the system. I don't know how much that's happening in the NHS, given all the cuts. I don't know how much that's happening here in the United States, given how entrepreneurial the system is. But it definitely does happen, and you want to try to find practitioners who do give you some of that along with their technical expertise.
And I'll add to that, to what Drew is saying. Medical education, especially in America, trained physicians and allied health professionals in a way that very poorly addresses these existential questions. The training is largely techno-scientific, and often what goes missing is the human being, the ability to empathize, to express and embody compassion, to listen. Oftentimes in the clinical encounter, the doctor is spending more time looking at a screen than looking at the person. And it's not really the fault of the physician. It's the way medical education has developed. And in the United States, and I know this is the case in the NHS as well, the age of managed care has created a kind of assembly line model of healthcare delivery, which has become overwhelming for physicians and for nurses. And this is one of the reasons I think that is contributing to profound explosions of mental health problems and suicide rates among physicians. And this became extremely exposed during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. And so the structural features of healthcare delivery get in the way often of humanized care. And I think many thoughtful and reflective physicians are quite aware of this, and they would much rather have 3 or 4 patient consultations a day than 30.
Thanks. So I figured before we have the audience Q&A, which we will in a second, we could touch on the last of our triad. We've done a fair bit on illness and aging, but I thought we'd go with death. So when I was reading through your book, Kevin, I highlighted a few thinkers and themes. One of them was Pascal on diversion and distraction. One of them was Nietzsche on gratitude. But I thought maybe we could close this part of the event by you saying a little bit about Kierkegaard on death. You write that Kierkegaard was haunted by death, and through his philosophy advocated an attitude of earnestness in relation to death. So I was hoping you could just say a little bit of about Kierkegaard, or the way in which you frame the chapter on death in your book.
Yeah, I think Kierkegaard, among all of the existentialists, was quite haunted by death. And the word kirkegård in Danish means graveyard. And so his name is homonymous with graveyard. And he actually has a wonderful essay called Reflections at or by the Graveyard. And of course, death for Kierkegaard isn't really a reflection on one's own biophysical demise. It's a reflection on our temporal nature, that we exist as temporal, finite beings. And for that reason, we can't take our existence for granted. And his conception of earnestness is an attitude of existential honesty and openness and acceptance about our temporal nature, not for some morbid fascination, but because it gives our life a sense of intensity and urgency and what Kierkegaard calls passion that it otherwise wouldn't have if we continue to just drift through life without any recognition that our time is limited and won't extend on forever, and that it can be snatched away at any time.
Drew, is there anything you wanted to pick up on Kevin's, what Kevin said just then before we move to the Q&A?
Well, I guess I'm going to be Kevin-like and be an existentialist for a minute, even though I'm not really, and just say, in the same way that we're forging and questioning the meaning of our life, we're also forging, questioning the meaning of our death, and to come into encounter with death. We see this in the story of how Siddhartha Gautama started his spiritual quest to become a Buddha. There's the legend of how, for the first time, his father tried to systematically not allow him to see any signs of aging, illness, or death. And one day he sees a sick person, one day an old person, and one day a corpse. And he comes to understand that this is the fate of all human beings. And it really just challenges him to go very deep in his explorations into the heart of suffering and what will relieve that suffering. And I think what we discover in that quest is very individual. Sometimes it's culturally determined, sometimes it's very idiosyncratic. But I know as I get older, and I'm close to 70, the meaning of my life as I've chosen to live it is a little bit more in the rearview mirror, but the meaning of my death is still, I'm looking at it through the windshield. My car is heading in that direction, and that pushes you to get real. It's hopefully in a good way, as opposed to just a sad or depressing way.
Mm-hmm.
Super. So I can see some questions have come in, and they seem to be nicely spread between one that would be more obviously a question for Drew. I'll start with one from Naomi, which I think is clearly a question for Kevin, but again, Drew may have something to say. So I guess Naomi picked up on in the conversation about authenticity, about the idea of the authentic racist, and then noticed that you spoke to the claim of authenticity as requiring a commitment to removing obstacles to others' authenticity. And then she says, but that's what I think morality largely comes to. At the very least, it is an important moral commitment. So the question is, how does authenticity supersede or call for rebellion against morality, as you were mentioning earlier? Thanks, Naomi.
Yeah, it's a good question, Naomi. And the question for the existentialist is, whose morality? On the basis of what are you calling morality, or a moral absolute? Is it the Ten Commandments? Is it the Golden Rule? Is it Kant's categorical imperative? Is it John Stuart Mill's utilitarian calculus? The existentialists don't offer moral prescriptions at all. And people wonder then, well, what's to prevent someone from being an authentic racist or an authentic serial killer? Well, nothing. The problem is, if you're a racist or a serial killer, that's who you are. You are a racist and a murderer. You can't blame anyone else but your own actions for the self that you create. So the freedom that comes with authenticity comes with a profound sense of responsibility. You are what you make of yourself. And it's not, you're not who you think you are what you do. And so if what you do is commit acts of racist hate, then you're a hateful, racist person. And that informs your identity. But you can't appeal to some morality out there somewhere that has no objective foundation or justification. This is what Nietzsche famously meant when he said, God is dead. There are no moral absolutes that we can turn to. But that doesn't mean morality goes away. It means that it becomes a personal confrontation, a personal action that you have to take responsibility for.
Thanks, Kevin. Drew, is there anything in Kevin's response to Naomi's question that you'd like to pick up on, or anything in Naomi's question itself you'd like to pick up on?
No, I know there are a series of questions, so I'll make time to make sure we can take on some others.
Cool. Well, this is one that seems definitely oriented towards you as both a medical professional and philosopher. So this is from Vicky, who asks, could you share your thoughts on whether and how health professionals do and should encourage explicit conversations about anticipating death and decisions about escalating life-prolonging treatment or moving to palliative goals? So, Drew, do you want to have a stab at that one?
I might kick it over to Kevin. Kevin, because I don't feel like I've put enough thought into this to have a really deep and thoughtful response. And I have confidence that Kevin always has a deep and thoughtful response. And this is in his territory of
well, I think hospice and the emergence of palliative care medicine in the last 5 decades or so has been an incredibly valuable movement, because in some ways it involves, I guess what Drew and I would call acceptance and surrender, the recognition that more medical intervention is going to cause more harm, and that there's an opportunity now to actually have a good death, a death surrounded by loved ones in your home, or not in the sterile, dehumanizing confines of a hospital room. And I think it also opens up deeper bioethical questions regarding the incredibly important discussions of death with dignity via medically assisted suicide. Sorry about that. I'm getting distracted by my phone. And that's worthy of a discussion on its own. When one is ready to call it a life and die with some measure of dignity rather than being connected to machines to keep him or her alive. It's something I think quite a bit about as I move more deeply into the evening of life. And I know Drew has given it a lot of thought as well.
Thanks. So there's a question that I think Drew will have to take, because I think it's kind of framed around the opening paragraph, the blurb of his book in a way. It's from Catherine, and she asked, could you say a little bit more about healing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic? How might those with or without, I think it's just popped over, one sec. How might those with or without COVID learn from people with experience of chronic illness?
Yeah, I think I can see it going both ways, that people who have not had chronic illnesses, but who experience even just the quarantine dimensions that went on during the COVID era, felt some of that sense of physical vulnerability, caution, the spatial constriction, the isolation of others. So I remember seeing something in the New York Times where people with chronic illnesses, in a certain sense, were less fazed by the COVID epidemic because they knew how to handle it. They knew how to negotiate this kind of disrupted and constricted life with a little bit of skill, how to remain, close with loved ones even when you were physically isolated. And the rest of us kind of had to learn that skill. And, going back to the theme in my book of healing, and actually this summer, Kevin and I want to collaborate on an article together about kind of the gifts of illness, the beauty or the realizations that come with it, which can be a bit of a taboo topic because you don't want to, minimize the suffering that goes along with that. But I know during COVID, whether you actually caught COVID or you didn't, people started connecting with loved ones remotely who they may not have, seen for years. And suddenly, hey, we can get on a Zoom call and be present to one another. People started becoming so desperate to leave their homes that they found local parks or nature walks, and they started reconnecting with the beauty of the natural world. They were, the economies began to shut down, but people were free of that kind of rat race, materialistic pursuit of success. So, environmentally, the earth started to breathe a little bit more freely, less greenhouse gases spewed into the environment. So it was very hard. It was, very tragic for certain individuals and loved ones. And as Kevin mentioned, healthcare professionals were absolutely overwhelmed. It was like being in a war zone. the inadequacy of our care mechanisms were exposed. So once again, I don't mean to minimize the suffering that comes along with it. But then there's also that issue of where can we find the gifts, the blessings, the opportunities, and try to lean into those healing dimensions, whether it's a kind of social catastrophe like COVID, or it's an individual catastrophe, like, let's say, Kevin's heart attack.
Thanks. Yeah, I did pick up on that as a theme in both of your books. I mean, I sort of framed it more as the value of suffering, but you were calling it like the gifts of illness. And I suppose if you haven't got a framework to make sense of suffering, then you will tend to see it all as meaningless and to be eradicated. But in a sense, you both look for the gifts that it could offer, and that perhaps health can't offer because you just plod along in your normal ways. But anyway, I thought we'd end with a lovely pithy question from Ian. I'll put it to Kevin first, but Drew may have something to say on it as well, which is, why have philosophers typically neglected mortality compared to, say, mind, language, and science?
That's such a good question. I wish it wasn't the case. I think it hasn't always been like that. In antiquity, death was a very serious topic of philosophical discussion, and that fell out of favor in the Middle Ages, and especially in what is called the epistemological turn in the 17th and 18th century, where questions about knowledge, truth, and language became more pressing. But I think the anthropologist Ernest Becker gets it right when he argues that death is scary. And we live in a culture where we generally deny death. We don't like to talk about it. We don't like to be honest and open about our fears of death, about our own finitude. And for that reason, we kind of cultivate a cultural self-deception about the reality of the human condition. And this is something that Stoic philosophers discussed at length, Epicurean philosophers, Socrates discusses this at length. And so it's really unique to academic philosophy, much to the detriment of the academy.
Thanks, Kevin. Drew, do you have any comments on Ian's question about the relative lack of philosophical interest in death?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with what Kevin said, that this is a, kind of a historical phenomenon. Of course, in the kind of existentialism that Kevin is explicating, Heidegger talked a lot about being unto death. We talked earlier about Kierkegaard. So you may see that more in sort of continental European philosophy as a theme than in the more epistemological Anglo-American philosophy of logic, philosophy of science, philosophy of language focus. But I do think whether or not you call it philosophy, quote unquote, this kind of memento mori, the remembering one's death, is so important in Buddhism. It's so important in Hinduism. It's very present in Chinese Taoism, very present in the history of Christianity. So this notion of, even though it's scary and threatening, don't deny death, remain aware of that, is a philosophical lesson that resonates throughout the ages and from many different cultures.
Thank you so much. So actually, there's a final question from Dee, which I guess we can't necessarily turn to, but it does address what Kevin was saying about other philosophers from the ancient traditions you've touched. It's a mentioned Seneca's comment along the lines of, as long as you can worry about dying, you're not dead, and once you're dead, you can't worry about it anymore. And he was wondering if that kind of sentiment was in any way relevant or useful in your own ways of thinking about death. I guess we could perhaps go for a one-word answer. Kevin,
Yes, yes.
have you found Seneca useful in that sentiment?
Very, very useful.
Drew?
Yeah, I've had a bit of a medical scare. I'm waiting to hear the results of a test, and I've thought very much about the fact that we live in the present. That it's now, right now. It's only ever always been now for every conscious being, and death is the one thing that doesn't really happen in the now, at least in terms of conscious awareness. And so I guess I would just say something about the denial of death. I don't see it quite as negatively as it sometimes is seen as in existentialism. I think there might be a sense that individuals have that on a most profound, quote unquote, spiritual level, we are deathless, or we are connected to that which is in the eternal, not just in the temporal. And therefore, having that sense of it isn't just a kind of running away denial because of fear, but it might be a very profound truth. That it's hard to get at through the level of the conscious mind, but through maybe deepened modes of spiritual practice, we can allow that truth to blossom. I see Kevin actually nodding in agreement, which I wouldn't necessarily expect, but
oh yeah. I'm moving more in that direction, Drew. Possibly anticipating some insights from psychedelic experiences that are reminding me about the importance or the possibility of our eternal nature.